Okay, great. So let's get started here. About 9 minutes after. So thank you everybody for joining. This is really exciting. This is the second time we've had an event like this. Today I will be talking about a topic that it has just come up in my own vocabulary. Like, that was a difficult interview, or like, what is a difficult interview? And we'll be talking about different aspects of difficult interviews and then how to overcome those. I'll give you some strategies, some actual strategies to help you help you improve access to the data that you want and that you need for your projects. I will also problematize my own use of the word access when it comes to people. So, because that gives me a lot of anxiety, actually. All right, so let's see. Gaining access to customers structurally, customer data structurally, and then within the setting of a one-on-one interview, as well as participants in research, because in my mind, it is wise to consider stakeholders as participants in research. So just wanted to note here, my brother is a professional rock climber, and this is a photo of us struggling through the Moab desert last year. And I will say this whole experience was extremely difficult because I am afraid of heights, like absolutely terrified of heights. But it's kind of given me an orange theme to match with our User Research Academy orange theme. So this was initially what the event was called, and it turns out that Eventbrite sort of shortened your title. So my title was quite long when I put this together, and then this is what it got shortened to on Eventbrite. So difficult interviews, gaining access to customers within one-on-one. And when this happened, I got very stressed out. So this is where I want to challenge my own use of the word access, because I don't view humans as things to like crack open like a nut or like a can or something and like get access and like pull their guts out. Like, it seems very exploitative to say gain access to people, right? Like, we wouldn't say that about our friends. We wouldn't say gained access to my friend today, like when we're talking about her troubles or something. Like, it seems kind of inappropriate. So I wanted to change this talk to just difficult interviews straight up. That seems size rendering of who I am. That this is actually a 6-foot tall painting that my friend from undergrad and my roommate Todd Kunkler painted of me. So I see my internet connection is unstable. However, because I'm connected on my phone, I hope that everything's still okay with the audio. Let that person in. Cool. So I am Babz. I live in Ireland. I am a trained sociologist, trained in visual and ethnographic sociology. So what I was trained in with ethnography, because that word has lost a little bit of its meaning, but also expanded in its meaning over the years. It's very much a discussion on what ethnography means, and people throw the term around. So what I would like to clarify is that when I say ethnography, I was trained in particularly performing grounded theory research with people who are sociologically vulnerable. So they have unstable jobs, or they might represent minority populations in society. So I really like birds. Great. I can't really see this. Hold on. There you go. Okay, outline. So what we'll be talking about, some guidelines for gaining access to data, like customer data. So using platforms like Salesforce, for instance, which is something we have. And then also guidelines for collaboration. I don't know I'm a particular expert on anything, but I do like to share my experience, because it is something that I do all the time. So I'm happy to have a platform like this to be able to talk through some of my learnings and some guiding principles that I socialize within my company, but also help mentor folks outside of my company, and especially people who have not had training in sociological theory or practice too. So like people who are coming from diverse backgrounds and different educational backgrounds as well. So some issues on ethics too, I hope we can discuss. We'll talk about processes as well. So like things to do on the call when you're talking to people, whether they're stakeholders or people you're interviewing. And we'll talk a bit about why taking notes and using tools for framing your discussions is incredibly important. So we'll talk a little bit about what I consider to be some basic truths too. Use is not utility, and we'll get into that. And your participant is trustworthy. So just some issues that have come up in my experience and user experience over the years in UX, like as a program. Okay, so we'll talk a bit about access. When you're stepping into this interview space, it is to become more human, not less human. So something that there's particular things that bother me about myself and about some conversations that I've been privy to, or some recommendations that I've heard, so just being very vague there. And I'll talk about some specifics. So we'll assess issues of gaining access to customers generally at large corporate environments. I work in a large corporate environment, and I should say that what the views I'm reflecting here do not actually reflect the views of my company. I am here as Babz, not as somebody who works for my employer. So have to say that. We'll also talk about engaging customers within the setting of an in-depth interview. Welcome to the folks who are coming in. Okay, so access is twofold. It's getting people on the phone. So getting their email, getting their contact information from a service like Salesforce. This is also getting your colleagues on the phone to do important stakeholder research for the first phase of research, which is my favorite thing to do. So internal research is great. We'll also talk about establishing rapport with colleagues as stakeholders, so navigating corporate structure in order to get folks on the line who can really help you with your work. And then we'll talk about crafting collaborative conversations with customers. It's like 4 C's there. And then as you're putting questions or comments into your parking lot or into or car park, as it were in Ireland, or into the chat, feel free to discuss these topics on your own. And then I'm really interested to hear what you guys have as far as strategies and observations when I'm done presenting my content. So I will be talking about the word scripts, because that's one of my least favorite words. So access is twofold. As mentioned, you got to get the person on the phone, and then you have to lead a conversation out of the collaborative conversation. You're not prying this information out from them. You are working with this human being to get to their core needs and their core issues. I honestly believe that it is possible to participate in ethical design, even though, you know, I've had this conversation with colleagues who work at very large tech firms, and then tech, as it should be, is very highly criticized for its practices. And it definitely has to be, but I also believe that there have to be people within these structures to advocate for ethical practice and to try to keep these companies in check. I think a really good example is taking a look at the Google AI and how AI has there had to be people to discover that, to put it on Google's radar, for example. Okay, so cool. That's a bit of a side note. But gaining access to customers by leveraging allies across your organization, and then establishing rapport with people within the context of an interview. I will also mention before we move on to collaboration strategies is that there is no project too small. There is no ask that you get at work or from a colleague that you can't be ethical in practice and you can't be collaborative. There is nothing too quick that you can't keep in mind that you're building a technology for humans, right? And so keeping ourselves centered around this of this needs to be an ethical practice and a collaborative one. So first off, collaboration, at least for me in my practice, starts with your team across divisions. So I set these things up at work. I call them expert interviews. You could call them stakeholder interviews. But recently I've been working on a project that is taking a look at the way that customers install devices, very, very vaguely, right? So what I did is I set up installation experience expert interviews with a host of people, about a dozen people from sales and customer support and service, as well as our distribution and warehousing and deployment services teams, to figure out what their perspectives were as people who are part of this process of customers installing devices, but then also what they think of customers and their experience with Even as a researcher, I am not always the first person to talk to customers. It's usually the salesperson, right? And it's usually customer success managers who are working with people on the daily. So keeping those folks, keeping allied with those folks and making sure you can support them and their needs, and then they will help you, I promise. Okay, so here's an example of something I've been working on. So like sales and marketing interviews, barriers to Selfinsult, right? So talking about the gains and pain in customer jobs. I did not invent this. If you look at lean practices, look at like lean stakeholder maps, you will find things like this. These are maps from, I think, Synergizer, something like that. I have the book over here. I can find it during the Q&A, but or Strategizer, but it's spelled with a Y. Sorry, that's what it was. Strategizer is spelled with a Y and a Z. So there's some excellent templates that you can use. You can walk into a discussion with your colleagues and say like, hey, I want 15 minutes of your time, put it on the calendar. You're an expert on this. Let's talk about it. So it's more effort than planned. Your stakeholders might not immediately see the value in doing stuff like this. They'll be like, wait, who are you? What is user experience? How can you make my life better? Why am I spending 15 minutes of my incredibly hectic schedule talking to you about something I know is important to you, but you know, making the connection with this individual as a person and be like, hey, I want your expertise because this is going to help make your job easier if we understand customers' needs better. So what I like to do is, I'm pretty sure everyone I've met in Ireland, by the way, is named David or Dave. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but pretty much everyone is Dave. And so here's an example of a chat that I sent a Dave because I needed to talk to this person. He hadn't accepted the invite. I hadn't heard from him. I sent him a chat and then almost immediately he's like, oh yeah, totally. I'm gonna be like 2 minutes late to that call, no problem. So checking in a couple of times, making sure, you know, keeping the touch high, especially if you've never talked to one of these people, is crucial. Okay, the call. We will also, well, actually, that's all I'm going to cover right now for talking to stakeholders because I want to make sure we have a lot of time. But while we're on the topic of a call generally, so I just shared one strategy of one note-taking template you might use. Sorry, I should elaborate more on this. So talking about something like Selfinsult or talking, because a lot of Fleetmatics companies like the one I work for have this Selfinsult strategy. So I was trying to understand a little bit from sales perspective, so like Dave's perspective on like what the gains were for Selfinsult. How does Selfinsult help customers, right? How does it hurt customers, or how does it provide any sort of pain points for customers? And then also jobs to be done, which is slightly ancillary to this. But so Dave and I were able to talk, I think, much over the time we allotted because he was an extremely knowledgeable individual. We were able to talk in depth about his perspective of customers' gains and pains for something like installation of our hardware. So I want to also mention that Dave is not the customer, right? He does not use our product. He is an expert, he's an internal expert of the product. So this is like kind of adjacent research. But again, because Dave is talking to customers actually more than I am as a user researcher, he has a very good understanding of what their needs are. And so when packaging things, I will package it as expert interviews, and then I will package separately customer interviews. Keeping the data separate is really crucial too. And then you're able to compare and contrast the different realities. What's nice about doing internal interviews as well is that not only is Dave talking about customer pains and gains, but Dave is actually talking about his pains and gains, so issues that he has, right? And that allows us to do a bit of service design work internally to say like, hey, how can we help Dave help his customers, right? So it adds, it really touches, this kind of research really touches like everybody in the organization. I have found mixed results getting internal folks on the line, right? It really helps if you're willing to be flexible, move the meeting time, you know, ping them ahead of time, be like, hey, I already sent this to you. Just like kind of letting go of your pride a little bit and like letting go of the idea that this person should know who you are. They probably won't. But once you get to talk to them, you can then go back to them again when you have questions, and then they can feel free to come to you if they have any issues or questions that need to be solved. I always ask our internal folks how they want to be updated on the presentation. So if they want to be part of the first readout, that's great. If they want the emailed top line, that's awesome. And I make note of that when talking to people so they feel involved and like they're collaborating. Cool. So, on the call. Great. Myth of a script. This is my favorite bone to pick with mostly myself. We'll talk about the myth of a script. We'll also talk about establishing rapport with people, being human-centered, which is decentering yourself. I know you're a human, or you're likely a human, but it's also not about your experience. It's about this other person's experience. That's what I mean there. It's about listening, setting up for exploration, not setting up for following a script. Something my boyfriend said recently, he's like, well, if you have a script, then why don't you just write the answers? It's like, why did you even bother talking to somebody if you already know what the answers are going to be, right? If you can plan the conversation out in advance. He owns a gym, by the way. He doesn't work in my field, but he has some very interesting observations that really helped me think. So in any case, not using a script, but also taking notes on using tools. Okay. I'm not sure what I've done here. Okay, I guess we're talking about these things now. I really like The Office. Who has Office? It would be good on you to watch it. But there's a series of scenes where these consultants are trying to figure out what people do at work, right? And here's this guy who basically has my job, which is like, he's the interlocutor between the customer and the sales team. And so he's arguing, he's like, well, I have good people skills. Like he's trying not to get fired, essentially, because it's like he has this very dubious job, which sometimes I feel like I have too. It's like, I am the person that talks to everybody. So again, great. Yeah, so these are the Bobs that are interrogating people to see who they can fire. Insider reference, I guess, but I'm sure everyone's seen The Office. Okay, so let's talk about taking notes and using tools. So this is something that we use on my team. I've done a couple talks on lean methodologies for ethnography, so I won't dwell here for too long, but this is something that that I am happy to elaborate on later. I also recommend reading the book, or skimming the book, or Googling the book, which is what we have here. So I found a lovely illustration of what the Lean Product Playbook is, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. So let's narrow in on this section of it. So the area that I work in the Lean Product Playbook cycle is this area here. This is the problem and solution space, and mostly I'm in the problem space. So it's a lot of learning, hypothesizing, which would be in the form of like research questions, right, which would guide your research. And then it would move into the solution space, which would be designing perhaps a prototype, right, and then testing that. And then you go back to the drawing board of learning and hypothesizing. So the Lean Product Playbook gives you tools similar to the one I showed earlier of the pains and gains and jobs, gives you tools for understanding and communicating with stakeholders and customers. So some benefits are that it can be very quick, and when everybody has the same, this is something I heard from a yoga teacher many years ago, like this idea of like making a commitment and setting up boundaries can actually allow you to expand more than you realize. And her point was like, okay, so you're here for an hour. What are you going to do in this hour? Like, you're going to suffer and do yoga, or you can just like, you know, zone out, whatever. What I find is like setting boundaries here, like having a template actually allows people to relax and feel very comfortable. And because it's like, clearly we're going to answer these things. You want to talk about pains and gains? Awesome, I can do that. I find that if people don't really understand the course of your conversation or what's expected of them, more anxiety can occur. So again, benefits of a template, simple starting point. very clear outline. You can quickly iterate too. If you're having people answer all the same questions, it's easy to collate these insights. It allows you to test assumptions as well, of course. So one very useful application of the stakeholder interviews, internal stakeholder interviews, is that you can summarize those and then they turn into company assumptions. Like the company assumes that installations will look like this for customers. I can take those and that's my start point for customer research. I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna go and validate or invalidate these things or expand upon these points. And then I do more synthesis of all the interviews to find related points. Yep, so it gives you a starting point. For me, as somebody who has a lot of anxiety, this is great. I love starting off with templates like this. It also works very well with continuous discovery research. Again, this like with a term with ethnography, like what does it actually mean? But with continuous discovery, it's something where you can go in and test hypotheses and refine them, and you can go back and do research on a topic for a longitudinal period of time, right? And develop a very rich understanding of this thing, which is something I get to do at work, which is excellent. Here's some examples. So talk about notes here. This is generally what my notes look like. It's all over the place. Something that I learned at university is that taking notes, I don't remember anything. I record my interviews and I get them transcribed, but before I even look at the transcription, I already have a mapped out, basically like a thematic map of the kind of conversations that we were having, right? So it's like, oh, here's a topic. Okay, it's like, whatever the heck this means. Here's a big important word. These sort of, I make a map in my notes so that once I'm done with the interview, I can, I can pop into a call with my colleagues, can give a rundown. I used to teach English full time. I actually taught English to a diplomat, and this is where I got this method of like highly visual note taking and gestures that mean something to you. I would read for like 10 minutes to this guy, and then he would read back almost verbatim like what I had said. And so he found ways to indicate the structure, like keywords and topics, and so he could relay that back to me. I do the same thing with customers, but in my own abbreviated template or ways. That was Tales from a Russian Diplomat. Staying engaged. Personally, as somebody who is extremely wiggly, I really like physical engagement and things. You can probably see me flailing around, right? Staying engaged, I think, is critical, and it's something you owe the person that you're talking to. It is polite, but it's considerate as well, and it also allows you to stay grounded in the conversation and follow the conversation. So something I think is important about taking notes as well, helps you track the content and direction of the conversation. And so like, let's say you have a script, right? It's like questions 1 through 12. If the participant answers the first question, cool, they tell you a little bit about their business. Second question is like, how do you feel about this topic? And then you have the option of following that thread, or you can ask your next question, which might not be related. I'd highly recommend following that thread. And the one reason that I like to circle things is I need to come back to that. It's like, oh, you mentioned something about using GroundCloud or Salesforce. Can you tell me more about that? So I give myself visual indications of things to come to. I'll take physical notes. Sometimes I am typing like in a spreadsheet if I want it to be immediately findable, like a Command F kind of situation for stakeholders, pull direct quotes. This is a favorite method. Okay, and highlighting example quotes in the audio. So when your participant says something that is useful, I would recommend noting that. So writing down like M24 for like minute 24 of the call, so you can come to the thing. So what's the big deal about note taking? These are actually tools for you to stay grounded and focused on the conversation. They allow you to relax into this conversation you're having with this person, so you can follow them. They can lead you through their lives and through their day. And you can ask questions as follow-ups along this path, right? So you like build this path with the person instead of coming to the person with this like, well, I have these questions to answer from stakeholders. And so I'm going to ask those questions directly. I find that you can actually get all your questions answered if you follow that person. So if I want to learn about installation, for example, like the recent example, everything they say about installation is going to be valid, right? Something I heard fairly recently was actually like, oh, I had a call with somebody and it wasn't useful. And that made me think like, how is that even possible? Like this person uses our product, they need our product, right? And it's our job to improve the product and make sure it meets their needs better. There's no such thing as a useless interview. Like if your person can't answer your questions, you might be asking the wrong questions. This has been mentioned earlier, is that taking the individual as an expert of themselves, right? I take every customer as the expert. They are the expert. They're using the product. I don't even have a login for my product, right? I bet a bunch of people don't understand our whole product suite if we're at larger companies. So just trusting this person and that everything they say is a correct representation of themselves, right? Of course, you have outliers that like, they might, I don't know, who knows, like, I've actually never had an outlier conversation before. I did have one person who wanted to disagree with everything I said, which was kind of weird because the conversation just like basically was like a spur mark because everything was contradicted. So I don't know what was going on there, but I've talked to hundreds of people and I can only think of one example of where somebody was like clearly not like, might not even have been a customer, honestly. So that's one out of like possibly 300 people in the last year I've spoken to. So again, staying grounded, staying engaged, staying focused. I know that we're all working from home and it's difficult to manage distractions, but find ways that work for you. If it's turning off your camera, if it's turning on your camera. I sometimes do audio only calls. Sometimes I do video calls as well. It just depends. Match the person where they're at. Like if your participant has their camera on, try to have your camera on if you feel comfortable with that. Make yourself comfortable, but also work on making the other person feel welcome in this conversation. So one thing I recommend too, because you're engaged and you're note-taking in some sort of capacity so that you can relay back to stakeholders and so that you can actually stay involved in the conversation yourself, I'd recommend ending the call with an idea of key insights. So like for installation, it's like, oh, this person does installs at this time of day because it aligns with this other thing that they have going on at their company. It's like, okay, cool, that's an insight. Like totally just made that up. But basically, have summary points for yourself, because if you're doing a lot of calls, you're not going to remember. It's kind of like I have a friend who is an herbalist, and I don't know if you guys have seen tinctures before, but herbalist, when you put a plant in a bottle with alcohol and it dissolves, they all look the same. And she's like, yeah, when I started off in practice, I thought I know exactly what I was putting in the bottles. And then she let those sit for a couple of days and they all turned to be dark green. And then she had no idea what was in the bottles. Just make sure you know what's in your bottles. This is kind of like if you go to a bulk food store and you just end up with things in packages, like not knowing what's in there. Make sure you label your conversations like your bottles and that you know what key insights were from each person, each conversation. One of my favorite examples of interviewing, and I will also mention that FBI profiling is extremely problematic, but in the situation of this TV show, Mindhunter, it's very interesting to show how their behavioral unit, of course this is fictionalized, but how their behavioral unit started studying behavior to understand people, right? And what they left with were like thematic understandings, and this is something that we as user researchers do at work too. Helps you predict the future. So predicting what kind of features will be best for your users. And help you, even if you have a small sample, just a note about sample sizes, like qualitative, I aim, my magic number is 12. If per project I can talk to 12 people, that's fantastic. I've had projects where I've spoken to over 50 people. And honestly, I think it's like Nielsen Norman says, after like 5 people, some of the results start to repeat. So look to the point where your sample size is starting to repeat. Also at that point, you can innovate and change your questions, right? So you can refine your questions, you can go off on tangents, you can follow some interesting threads, right? Once you have your answers that you're beholden to from stakeholders or from your product or testing, you can go off on these tangents with the rest of your sample size. I would also mention that not every single person is going to be able to answer all of your questions, right? So let's say a person actually never did an installation. Maybe they can tell me about how they planned the installation. Maybe they planned the installation, they didn't actually do it. So even if you get on this call, a call with somebody and you think there's no way this person is going to be able to answer all these things, they probably won't, right? But they still are the experts, they still have information that is very useful to you and your product team, right? I have a note too on questions in a second, and it's up in a couple of slides. So one of my final points here is that we're only here, I only have a job as long as I am helping my customers accomplish their work, right? So understanding their work at a deep level and providing rich insights to my product team about how to best meet their needs, that's gonna help me keep my job, right? So if you ever need to think about motivation, our products are only around as long as they're useful, right? So keeping that in mind and then putting their use at the very center of what we're looking at. So earlier I mentioned use is not utility. And so this is the sentence almost means nothing, honestly. But what I mean by this is like, if a person is using something in a particular way, or if they simply have it, if they're using it, that doesn't mean it's serving them to its full capacity, or we're not serving them at their full needs, right? So just because somebody is using something doesn't mean it's it's not providing them the most utility. I'm tripping my own self up with my stupid phrase, but like basically there's usually improvements you can make to your product, right? Cool. And our solutions ultimately have to be in line with the goals and needs and ambitions of our people. So I do B2B research exclusively. And I think this applies to B2C as well. And I have colleagues that also do B2C at my company. But these solutions that we build, sometimes we don't do user research first. Sometimes we don't put it first or central in our product build. But our solution will see greater longevity if it is really centered around the goals and needs, and then also growth ambitions of customers, right? If it allows customers to do their work and to survive and keep their businesses afloat, especially during like COVID, for instance, of like where you have extremely fluctuating professional markets, and making sure our solution is there for them. Like that's honestly what I think about at work, is like, how can our solution really help the people that pay for it? I also want to mention that there are some excellent people doing work on ethics. And so I recently took part in a course online called Humanity Centered, which is, I don't know if you guys can see this thingy. Okay, maybe you can see it now. But Vivian Castillo, she does a lot of work on ethics. She's been in many articles. She also leads this Humanity Centered course. I'd highly recommend it. I learned a lot from this 8-week course about ethics. It was like extremely humbling. And you know, as somebody, like I thought, I was like, oh, of course I'm doing ethical research. I learned so much from this class. So really have to give kudos to the Humanity Centered folks. Sakai as well. It was Sakai in one of our last meetings that said questions are extractive, right? When you're asking interview questions, you're extracting something from someone. So this is what gave me a lot of anxiety about like the whole gaining access, right? Cracking the nut of the human being. Sakai put it so well. It's like questions are extractive. You are taking something from somebody, like when you ask for information from them. So especially during COVID, when we're all working with customers who are in their own homes, right, that have like their family lives going on around them, just remember that like we are still in this role of like extracting information from people. And there are more ethical ways to do that than others. And that's something I would encourage everybody to take a look at. Take a look at humanity-centered, delve into some works, Alba as well. These three women are fantastic to look for guidance. I'm also a humongous fan of Esther Perel and Brene Brown. I think both of these leaders can teach us about ethics. So this is where I'm going to leave it. I can no longer see anything. Where'd my, oh, here we go.
Okay, I've jotted a few questions, so let me know. I can read those out. And I'll go with mine at the very end if we have time left. So the first one is from Timo. He's curious, why was the session being recorded and a comment. Yeah, it wasn't me. Sure.
How about now? Is that okay?
Yeah, I don't hear any echo.
Okay, I think
Awesome.
I think it was on me. I think I accidentally unmuted my computer. So
that's all good. Go ahead. Don't worry about it. It happens. You know, nobody's used to so much Zooming. Freaking COVID. But so he was curious, why is it being recorded? And what is the recording going to be used for? And then Carlos had a question saying, would it be shared later?
This recording, what it will be used for? So this is this particular recording, or you mean the recording interviews with participants?
Well, this one here.
Oh, yeah. So this is, not everybody's able to make this time. This is a public event and we want to improve access to our content, right? Thinking about people who don't have time. Like, I'm privileged that I can take an hour out of my work schedule to talk to you guys and hang out with you guys, but not everybody is, right? So this information is public and it is something that we are going to share with the community, right? Whoever wants to take a look at it.
Perfect. So with one answer, you on two questions, one from Timo and the other one from Carlos. We'll move on to Daria. She said, could you recommend or share a template to use for reporting the results of the user interviews?
Oh, that is a very hot question. I would refer to our favorite Nikki Anderson, to her Medium post. Fantastic content there. Something that happens in my work is that the content, right? So the kind of data visualizations that I use it depends on if there's a survey, that's going to be data viz. If there's not a survey, it's going to be different data viz. You can still run data viz on qualitative work, right? You can still say 90% of people said XYZ. So take a look. I have a favorite data visualist, John Grimwade. He is fantastic. He's worth a Google. He's got a blog. He posts every single day. He's got a LinkedIn. John Grimwade is great at data viz. And a little bit famous in the industry. But I would also say that output has to meet the questions you're trying to answer ultimately and the content, right? So if I wish, not on my work laptop, but sometimes I will write out the research questions, right? I put those on one side, and then I will write an abbreviated answer on the other side, and then have them fill in like one by one to get very straightforward answers to our research questions. So one research question for installation might be, is our current install app working for customers, right? And then I can write an answer right next to it. Or how do customers plan for an install? I can write an abbreviation right next to it. And that's what I like to lead my presentations with. It's like, here are the questions that you guys ask me in stakeholder interviews, and here's how I'm going to answer correctly. And then I have more slides elaborating on themes, right? Other things that have come up on the research. But I am very clear to answer questions clearly. And that helps stakeholders be involved too, because they're like, oh, I like Babz because she answers my questions. Yeah, so make sure you're answering questions, but then also make sure the form fits the content.
Perfect. And I just want to say Nikki's blogs on Medium are amazing.
So good, so good.
Okay, moving on to Timo again. He had a question, actually a request for the exchanges that you were mentioning, like with the diplomat. Would you happen to have a concrete example of somebody that you interviewed maybe for a product when you were designing?
When what, sorry?
When you were researching for a particular product, like you were interviewing someone, you have a concrete example that you could share similar to the one with the diplomat?
Oh yeah, I imagine like note taking, or I guess, sorry, I don't quite understand.
Okay, let me repeat it. What I was trying to clarify a little bit. He was suggesting.
That's okay.
Oh, go on, please. You can ask it yourself.
Yep. So you mentioned very, very quickly, you did a type of exchange with a diplomat. If I remember correctly, it was you'd read something to him and have him read something back to you verbatim or something like that. And then you said that you do that a fair bit with interviews now in your work. And I was wondering just how that would kind of look. And if you could give me sort of an example of how you've done that in your work, so I can kind of have a clearer idea how you do that.
Yeah, I am so sorry. That was misleading. So I learned from his approach where I would read to him for 10 minutes and then he would be able to repeat everything that I said back to me. And I don't use that in interviews. I just use that style of note taking. So his note taking allowed him to chart down exactly what I had said. And that's something I try to do with participants now. So like a participant will talk to me for 60 minutes and I will be taking frantic notes the whole time so that I can read those notes and then be able to relay that back to my team members. So I'm really sorry about that. The whole note-taking procedure is what I learned from working with a Russian diplomat, because he was an interpreter. So he had to listen to people and then interpret it in Russian or in English, vice versa, depending on it. So that's like an extremely high stress environment, right? And I've adapted some of those strategies to my environment, which is listening to people and accurately recording what they're saying. I hope that helps clarify. Sorry about that.
Sure does. Thank you.
Awesome. So the next one is from Alba, and she's it's also on note taking. The gist of her question is, the way you take notes, sometimes maybe you would try to highlight, if it's really on a pen and paper and it's a physical interview, you would try to highlight it, circle something or star something, mark something. Then the interviewee might get anxious or they may be distracted. So how do you balance that, balance documentation with participant distraction or anxiety?
That's amazing. That is fantastic. Such a good question. I'm going to put that in my presentation for next time. So I set the scene with somebody. So I had actually 4 interviews today for a project, but so I say things like, so I've been recently taking notes on a spreadsheet because I keep moving, honestly, and I don't have any paper. And so I just physically don't have paper. So when I'm taking notes on a spreadsheet, which is what I've been doing recently, I will say, hey, you might hear the clicking of my keyboard. I am taking notes so that I can remember the specific things, the specific examples that you're giving me later, right? So I call it kind of like addressing the curtain with Wizard of Oz. And I do this when requesting that people talk to me as well, like emailing potential participants who are customers that we have access to their data. So I'll send them an email and the email will say like, hi, I'm using this platform to recruit you to talk to. This is simply a scheduling tool. So like, let's say it's Calendly, which is something I use. It's like, you're gonna get this email from Calendly, for example, or from a CRM like MailChimp, and you can address that. You can say like, look, I promise this is Babz from Verizon, and I'm just using this tool. So like addressing the weird things. If you're taking notes and circling things, tell them why. Just be upfront. Say like, look, this is really important that I get this right. And I want to use a direct quote from you with your permission. Always ask permission to record the call as well. And my script for that is like, do you mind if I record this call so I can take notes from it later and I can pull specific examples? I don't want to misquote anybody. I don't want to get anything wrong. Just be upfront with that.
Perfect. Great. Well, the chat is fired. There are a lot of questions coming. I don't know how we are doing for time. I want to be
We've got
conscious of that.
7 minutes. I'm
Okay.
happy to stay. I'm happy to stay 5 minutes late. This will also be recorded.
Awesome.
Yeah, I can. Yeah,
That's
I
very
can
kind
keep
of you.
going.
So MC has two questions. We covered Abba's. Yeah, can you please share examples of questions we can ask customers about our physical products like beverage? And also, how should we structure our interview with the customer? Please, how to start the conversation, content, and physical product like juice. Those are the two questions
Oh,
combined that we
juice.
had from MC. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll address starting a conversation. That's what the second question was, right? How to start a conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what I like to do for starting a conversation is to introduce myself, introduce the project, level set. Again, this is a good time to mention, like, I'm going to be taking notes if that's all right with you. And everything you say is totally useful. Some of my colleagues like to say, like, there are no wrong answers. For some reason, that doesn't really resonate with me. But I just like to say that, like, everything you say we can use, right? Everything you say is valid in this context. And I'm just looking for your particular experience. So the first thing that I ask customers to do, so I can get an overview of like what's going on with them, because again, I do B2B research, I'll say, like, could you tell me a little bit about your roles and responsibilities at work? And then we will get a little of the company history, the fleet size, this person's occupation, their responsibilities. And then from there, I'm able to ask follow-up questions like, okay, so you said that you're a fleet manager and you are actually in charge of installing units. How do you plan an install? Like, or what's the first step in that? So to be honest, I don't always have discussion guides. That's what I would call a script, right? And I don't like the script thing because it seems scripted, which is like the literal definition of that word. So a discussion guide is what I would use as like a framework. I don't always have those because if it really is dependent on what people are telling me, like if it's really broad discovery work, I will just start with that and then I'll just go. Like if it's on a topic of install, or if it's a topic of evaluating business tools or whatever, if it's very broad like that and I have no idea what the second or third question is going to be, I'll just keep it in line with that theme. And that's how I start calls. I just follow on with what they're saying. The first question, concrete examples about juice. It depends on what you're trying to learn about juice. Are you interested in the person's metabolic experience? Like, do they get a sugar high? Are we talking about flavors? Do you like fermented juice? Do you like kombucha? That's sort of like juice. Like, it would really depend on the scope of your research and the research questions you're answering.
Perfect. That was very thorough. Thank you. On behalf of MC here. Nilesh says, love the sharing. How do you collate the insights?
Yeah, so I'm a trained sociologist. I will just say that I went to school for this. This doesn't mean that you can't do this. I would also refer again to Nikki's blog. Nikki's personal blog. She recently interviewed her boyfriend on a topic and then outlined her interview process there. So go read that, take a look at that. The way that I collate insights, you guys will remember I mentioned that I bold things and I highlight things. I honestly go back and look at my notes and see what I've bolded and highlighted. And if something comes up a lot, that's a theme, right? I also can use software like MaxQDA. I have colleagues who use Python or R modeling, like some more advanced programming skills. I don't have any of those skills, but I was trained in basically coding by hand, right? Which is extremely tedious and I don't honestly recommend it. But if you have software knowledge, go through, if you want to start with a word cloud, like if you have a bunch of transcripts and you want to run some sort of word cloud on those, figure out what terms, like what key terms are coming up, and then go dig into those terms and like, okay, so people are talking about installation and they always talk about customer service right after that. What's going on here? And so if that's something that I see, or if it's like installation and then planning for install. Okay, so part of installation is planning for it. Yeah. So when you see things starting to repeat across experiences, that's when you know you're onto something.
Oh, that's an amazing insight. Okay, moving on to the next question. I'm not sure I understand it very well, but I'm gonna read it word to word. This is from Salwa. Apologies if I'm not calling your name right. I like that you provide your participants with templates that gives them a sense of clarity. My question is, how do you balance this approach with the inductive that is inherent in conducting ethnographic research, which could uncover valuable insights? Yeah, I'm not sure if you got the question. I did not understand it well.
Maybe could that person explain a little bit more?
Yeah, if Salva, if you're still on the line, by all means.
I would be happy to explain a bit more, although you kind of have already answered part of that. So the templates that you use seem to provide the structure for the interview. And also when you explained how you actually label and structure the outcomes or in terms of spreadsheets, and that seemed to me in the beginning that it will somehow limit what kind of insights you can get, because you're getting specific answers to your questions. But you know, when we conduct ethnographic research, then we go out in the field and try to observe and try to notice what we couldn't have thought of when we were trying to prepare for the interview. So trying to figure out something that could lead to a product feature or could lead to a business strategy, and that is inherently quite unstructured. So it should be possible for the participants to actually talk somehow freely without the templates in order to get that insight. But then you sort of also mentioned examples of asking participants to tell you about something or talk about something, and then taking the direction where the conversation lead. But I would be happy to hear more from you about that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, and that's an excellent point, right? So the templates for me are literally a starting for everybody to treat something like a discussion guide, is that these are starting points, right? So they can also be the framework. So if I'm asking somebody about the pains that they experience while performing an install of our hardware, right? That the word like pain can mean a gazillion things. So for me, if I start with addressing pain specifically, people will have a lot of different ideas of what are pain points when installing our software. But then I can ask follow-up questions. So I think that's where the ethnographic thing comes in. It's like that is the moment where you go off script, you go off template, and then you try to discover a bit more about this person's experience, right? This whole idea of like grounded theory. So Brene Brown is actually somebody else who does grounded theory. If you've ever read any of her books, she practices the same kind of science that I do, right? That a lot of sociologists do, or qualitative researchers, a lot of you do, I'm sure too. Is you follow the data set and you look at your data set, and then this data set is interviews, right? Most of my data sets are interviews, and then I pull the theories from there. And so the grounded theory approach is like just following, basically, I don't know, I don't have any fancier words for this, but it's just like following what the person is saying, following their experience and honoring their experience, and not correcting them or not saying things like, oh, have you tried this? Or like, oh, you're not using that correctly. It's like, maybe the thing that they're using is just not correctly built, right? Like, so assuming that that person is an expert in knowing what they're doing and honoring them and like following that conversation. The templates for me, I mentioned kind of, they give a starting point and they ease anxiety for the person. Because if they see like, oh, we're talking about two things, this is easy. I can tell you about my pains and gains with the installation process. I hope that's helpful. I think the short answer is just following the conversation. And then also making observations that are outside that template. So if you're making observations about, so for instance, I started off with pains and gains, right? So internal stakeholders, pains and gains. I took that and then it formed my the direction of research with customers. And from that, my output was actually a journey of like different phases of the install journey. And then there were themes on the side of it. It's like, here's the process, and then here's the themes. Like, here's a big theme of trust. It's like, how does trust play in, right? Because everyone's talking about trust. We're talking about install. We're talking about the pains of install, but there's actually an undercurrent of trust, right? And that's part of the grounded theories. You can pull things like trust or trustworthiness out of the experience of installation, for instance. So that's a bit more on the grounded theory approach, is like just identifying what is. I'll take like one more question, and then you guys can follow up with me later.
Yeah,
I just want to be respectful.
I was gonna say, like, now literally we have 1 minute and there are like 4 questions lined up, and I had one as well. But how do we follow up with you?
What?
How do we follow up with you? Like, where do we reach out to us?
That's a good question. I'm on LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's the best. You don't have to worry with my email address or anything. But this will be online somehow. I think Nikki is going to handle it. Okay. But this will be available for content later. I think I'll get a transcript of the chat too, so I can read the chat.
Awesome.
But follow up with me on LinkedIn if you like.
I'll connect with you on LinkedIn. I do have 4 questions here, and then I had one. I'm gonna send those over so we can maybe answer it on the page where we publicized about the session.
Oh, I can also throw that up in Slack, actually. Let me just put, Prince, if you could send me those, I will post answers to these in Slack in the next couple days.
Yeah, I'm going to add you on LinkedIn, and then I'll send it to you there. I was literally just joining this session for the very first time, and I just offered to help.
No, that's great. So guys, as far as where I'll put the answers to these questions that Prince will send me, it'll be on our User Research Academy Slack channel. So if you're not there, make sure you're there. I will post it to the monthly Hangouts channel.
Would you happen to have the link to the Slack channel so you could put it in the chat? Maybe, I don't know if there are people that are new here like me.
I'm using the app version. I actually don't know.
Okay.
I'm not smart enough for this. I'm sorry, but if you're
worries.
there, look. User Research Academy. Nikki's got a nice website for us.
Okay, perfect. I'll look it up. So I'll send those 4 questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll answer those on Slack, and then folks can follow up with me individually. But thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I'm going to end the call now. So bye-bye.
Bye.